Good afternoon, everyone.
Professor. Afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Were you able to see the recordings on YouTube? Anyone was able to go to YouTube and check the recordings of the lectures? Because
I can check right now. Honestly, I didn't check before.
Yeah, because someone asked me and he said that he didn't have the recordings, or I wasn't sending you the links. So I said, well, the best thing to do is to go to YouTube, because all my recordings are there on YouTube. And I was just wondering if everyone had a chance to look at those recordings and see if everything is okay.
Yeah, I just checked.
Okay.
They work. Yeah, I can open them.
Okay. All right. That's good, as long as everything is working. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good.
Thank you.
Okay, then, well, we're getting very close to the midterm exam as we finish this chapter, of course, chapter 4, because as I told you, the midterm exam is going to be on the first 4 chapters. And hopefully we should be able to finish this chapter today. I don't think we really have a lot left, and as far as this chapter is concerned, we need to go over a few things, but other than that, once we finish this chapter, then we will have one session for reviewing the midterm exam, and then we will be going over some of the questions that you would probably see in the midterm exam. I have not written the questions yet, but hopefully by the end of today, I should be able to put some questions together. There'll probably be 3 questions out of 5, so you will be asked to answer 3 out of 5 questions. And well, again, we will talk about that when we get to it on the review session. Today, what I want to do is I want to go over the unemployment, because unemployment is pretty much, deals with the population, of course, the labor force. It deals with labor force participation rates. It deals with who is employed. Is it or who is unemployed? Is it the young versus the old, the skilled versus the unskilled, educated versus the less educated, etc., etc. So unemployment really becomes an extremely important demographic variable in the MENA region, and that's the reason why we have to focus a little bit more on unemployment, since basically it's what causes or gives rise, if you will, to one of the most important challenges that the MENA region policymakers have to deal with, and that is finding solutions to the high unemployment rates, especially among women and among the youth. And this is basically something that the MENA region has failed to find adequate solutions to. Today, what we want to do is we simply want to look at, first of all, the reasons for unemployment in the MENA region, and then what I want to do is I want to try and paint a picture, if you will, that will try to describe the characteristics of unemployment in the region. Some of it has to do with the reasons for unemployment and the factors, obviously, that lead to unemployment. And also, we want to basically see how the MENA region go about determining the rate of unemployment. So we want to look at the weaknesses, we want to look at the challenges, we want to look at the characteristics of the concept of unemployment in the MENA region. Now, some of the reasons, of course, for high rates of unemployment in the MENA region are, one of them, it's sometimes, the pundits in the MENA region refer to unemployment as simply being merely an affliction of the youth. In other words, it's just the bad luck of the MENA region to have such a high um, um, population that is composed of youths. In other words, like we said last time, if you remember, 60% of the population in the MENA region is young, is between, the ages of, let's say, in other words, 60% of the population in the MENA region is below 22 years old. And that makes population in the MENA region extremely young. And usually unemployment rates happen to be extremely high among the young, the youth. This is everywhere, by the way, not just in the MENA region. But if you look at unemployment rates of the youths versus the unemployment rates of adults, you will see that the unemployment rate is pretty much higher among the young, the teenagers, if you will, than it is among the adults. And it just happens that the MENA region's population happens to be such that 60% of it is probably those who are under 20, which, tells us that the unemployment rate in this country is going to be relatively high. So it's nothing but sometimes it's referred to as basically an affliction of the youth. It's just the bad luck that the population happens to be highly young. And that's the reason why you see high rates of unemployment. So that's number one. And number two, of course, you see that there is a high willingness for people in the MENA region, especially among the young and the educated, to actually wait for the right job. In other words, they're really not in a hurry to pretty much take any job that comes their way. And usually they are pretty much interested in landing jobs with the government, simply because government jobs are very secure. Government jobs usually pay much higher than the private sector. And government jobs include a lot of perks that the private sector doesn't have at all. So there is a lot of security with government jobs, and there is prestige that goes with it as well, if you're working in the civil servants. So, most people who are educated and young, they're willing to wait, until an opportunity arises that they will have in getting a government job. And that really creates unemployment, if you will, because it's people are just willing to be unemployed for a while until they get the job that they're looking for. So this does accentuate the unemployment problem in the MENA region. So that's another reason. The other reason, of course, is the high, what we call the high reservation wages that young people expect. And usually there is a huge gap between the market wage and the reservation wage. The reservation wage is the wage that the young and educated expect to attain. As long as there is this huge gap between the two, then people are really not excited to get a job at a very low wage, which is much, much below what the reservation wage is. So those are basically the major factors that can explain the reason why the unemployment rates in the MENA region are so high. Now, there are other things, characteristics, like we said, challenges, weaknesses. This is what we want to look at today. And some of the weaknesses, of course, in trying to determine what the unemployment rate is basically who is actually, in other words, we do have reputable institutions in many countries that are responsible for determining what the unemployment rate is. But in the MENA region, there is really no such specific or well-defined institution that has the responsibility of determining what the unemployment rate is. So it's usually done by a mixture of institutions. Some of them are private, some of them are public, try to obviously get a feel of what the unemployment rate is. And as a result, it's not something that it's pretty much relied on as a good source of determining what the unemployment rate is. Sometimes the IMF and the World Bank are also involved or engaged in coming up with unemployment rates in these countries. But overall, the unemployment rates in the MENA region are determined through what we call surveys. So anyone who really wants to get a feel of what the unemployment rate is conducts a survey. However, what type of surveys are there that are conducted to determine what the unemployment rate is? Usually the surveys are very weak, they lack resources, and also they lack a definite methodology. In other words, what are the basis of those surveys? What type of questions are posed in those surveys? Are these questions pertinent to actually finding what the unemployment rate is? That's number one. Number two, has the survey really defined what the unemployment rate is? So there are a lot of weaknesses that pertain to the definitions, to the methodologies that is used, and as a result, these surveys are not those that you can actually rely on as giving you accurate information regarding unemployment. So that's another problem that the MENA region faces in terms of determining what the unemployment rate is. And also, the labor force participation rate in the MENA region happens to be extremely low compared with other countries. Like, for example, if we look at the women labor force participation rate in the MENA region is probably about 25%. Now compare that with industrialized countries, which is close to 65%. So a huge difference. Other less developed countries, you find that um, the labor force participation rate amongst women is probably close to maybe 40, 45%. So it's right there um, with the industrialized countries of 65%. But for the MENA region, 25% is extremely low. Now, there are many reasons, of course, why the labor force participation rate amongst women in the MENA region is low. Partly it's partly cultural, meaning, large size families are usually preferred in the MENA region, and this really has to do with culture more than anything else. And also partly structural. Now, what do we mean by structural? Well, here, of course, we're simply talking about the structure of the economy, because women, not only in the MENA region, but all over the less developed countries, are employed mostly in the government sector or the public sector and in light manufacturing and services, of course. This is basically where you find women in the less developed countries and in the MENA region most employed in government sector, light manufacturing sector, and the services. So if you look at the structure of the MENA region economies, you will see that the government participation in the economy has obviously been reduced. And the reason, as we said before, because of pressure from the IMF and the World Bank on these governments to take the back seat. So we had the rollback of the state, if you remember, and countries in the MENA region shifted strategies from ISI to export-led growth. So for that reason, when you had the government step back and take the back seat, obviously that impacted the employment of women negatively. In other words, now the government was employing less people, basically. So that's number one. Number two, the private sector really did not fill the gap, simply because the private sector was extremely weak in the MENA region. And the development of light manufacturing really was also very weak. So because of that, you saw that the labor force participation rate amongst women in the MENA region was really not that strong. And it's 25%, which is extremely weak, of course. So that's another reason. And then you had the obviously, recently, you can see that there has been a huge increase in the labor force participation rate by women. And this all has to do with, obviously, number one, education, number two, government strategy to invest in human development, and also because of the private sector trying to pick up some of the slack that was left by the government in terms of light manufacturing. So you see that in the MENA region, light manufacturing sector or the private sector is becoming to become a little bit stronger. Now, all of this, of course, tended to favor labor force participation by women. And you can see that in the past 10, 15 years, that there has been a huge increase in the labor force participation rate. And I think it went up all the way to about 38%. So a huge increase from 25% to 38%. I don't know what the labor force participation rate is today for women, but I wouldn't be surprised if it went all the way up to 43 or 43%. But again, um, the main thing here is that labor force participation rate by women has increased in recent years, which obviously votes very well for the economies of the MENA region, because that's one asset that is extremely important in as far as economic growth and development is concerned. So that asset needs to be exploited as much as possible. Now, you can see that the gap between labor force growth and job creation has been a major policy challenge for the MENA region. In other words, they have not been able to narrow the gap. In other words, the gap seems to be widening between labor force growth, and this is an important demographic indicator in the MENA region, the rapid population growth, which obviously led to huge labor force growth, especially with the youth bulge that we just talked about in recent lectures. So this gap between population growth and the labor force, in other words, the population growth and labor force growth, of course, and job creation has been a major policy challenge for a lot of the policymakers in the MENA region. And unemployment, of course, in certain countries account for about 1/3 of the youth and 1/2 of women. So if you look at the unemployment rate in the MENA region, you find that it's about 33% among the youth and 50% among women. And those are huge numbers. Unemployment is generally much higher in cities than in rural areas. Now, why do you think that would be the case? Why would unemployment be much higher in cities than it would be in rural areas? What's the reason for that?
When rural areas have more like farming and more labor needed?
Yeah, but not necessarily. Why do you think that is the case?
Maybe because rural areas have less people. So.
No.
A lot of jobs in the city are already taken up by older employers.
Well, the main reason actually why you would see that unemployment is much higher in urban areas than it is in rural areas, it all has to do with necessity. You see, in rural areas, you really have to work in order to survive, because in rural areas, they are pretty much neglected by the central authorities. In other words, the central authority is pretty much focused on what is happening in urban areas. Rural areas are usually neglected. In other words, you don't see any help going to people who actually live in rural areas in terms of providing services, in terms of welfare, in terms of assistance, in terms of, all of that doesn't exist in rural areas. And that's the reason why you see a lot of people in rural areas sometimes happen to leave the rural areas and go to urban areas simply because there is they have a better chance, a better opportunity, not only of finding a job, but also a better opportunity of actually living. In other words, there is a lot of assistance available in terms of hospitals, in terms of schools, in terms of welfare checks, food stamps, you name it. All of these services are pretty much available in urban areas. But when it comes to rural areas, they are all on their own. There isn't really much help coming from the central government. And that's why in a lot of the less developed countries, and the MENA region in particular, a lot of people ask for decentralization of government. They really don't like to see the government being centralized. Why? Because when a government is centralized, those who are going to be benefiting from government services will be those who happen to be living in urban areas. And those people living in rural areas are pretty much ignored or neglected completely. So that's basically the reason why you always find that unemployment rates are much, much higher in urban areas than they are in rural areas. Now, much of the job expansion in the MENA region happens to be in the informal sector, such as construction, retails, and low productivity jobs, basically. We call that the informal sector. Now, there is a difference between the informal sector and the formal sector. The informal sector is usually in other words, you find very, very small companies with less than 3, 4, 5 people working, and everything is done under the table. Wages are paid under the table as well. You know, the owners of these businesses, they're not registered with the government. They don't apply for business licenses. They don't pay taxes. So, you know, we call that the informal sector. In other words, that really deals with cash. Sometimes it's also referred to as the underground economy, basically. So, you know, most of the people in the MENA region happens to be working for the informal sector. So the informal sector is a lot more important than the formal one. And you see that the structural adjustments that took place in the MENA region during the 1980s, as we had this shift from ISI to export-led growth, that's the structural adjustment that took place in the MENA region during the 80s. What happened during that period was that you saw a lot of good productive jobs, a lot of good productive jobs, well-paid jobs, were actually being replaced by less productive jobs, basically. In other words, as we moved from the ISI to the export-led, that's exactly what happened during that shift. A lot of people found jobs in the informal sector as the government rolled back, and a lot of the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, shut down. A lot of these people actually found jobs in the informal sector. They lost their jobs with the SOEs that were paying very well, or in factories or industries that were paying extremely well. They lost them simply because of the transition, the structural shift, if you will. And now these people actually found jobs in the um, less productive and in small companies that actually paid them cash and very, very low wages. And that's basically what happened during the transition. As of 2010, the informal sector was pretty much responsible for 70% of all the jobs. That's very scary. When you say that the informal sector in the MENA region is pretty much responsible for 70% of the jobs, and you know that the informal sector is pretty much based on low productive jobs, paying very, very low wages, um, no security whatsoever, that really paints a very, very dark picture in as far as the job market is concerned in the MENA region. And that's exactly what happened in 2010. In other words, 70% of the labor force was pretty much employed in the informal sector. The wage bill, and this is another staggering data for the MENA region, accounts for about 9% of GDP. And this is something that the MENA region has to try and reduce as much as possible, because you really can't have, you know. And the reason why I say this is because the MENA region is pretty much different from other less developed countries and other industrialized countries as well. Why? Because most of this wage that is paid, obviously, has to come from the government ultimately. And the government obviously would see that its budget, the one that it writes every year, at the end of every year, when you see that the wage bill happens to take a huge chunk of the budget, that's really not very sound in as far as economic management is concerned. Now, if you look at some countries in the MENA region, like Libya, for example, you find that the wage bill accounts not for 10%, but for close to 22% of GDP. That's very high. Now, what's the reason for that? It all amounts to corruption, basically. In other words, you find people that actually get 4 or 5 paychecks instead of one. Now, how do they do that? Again, through falsifying data, and it's all done through corruption, basically. I mean, the people who actually open the doors for you to be able to do something like this will get a cut from whatever you get in your wages. So it will go to civil servants at the top, who are actually making the decisions to cut checks for certain people. And corruption, again, is something that obviously has made things very, very difficult in the MENA region, in as far, especially with the resource-rich, labor-abundant, and resource-rich, labor-poor countries. Corruption is pretty much very imminent in these countries, and it has obviously done a lot of harm to the economic growth process. And so far, these countries have not come up with a solution to the corruption issue, to the corruption problem. So those are some of the things that obviously we see happening in the MENA region as far as the unemployment is concerned. Um, the the public sector, for example, and well, the formal sector. Let's look at the formal private sector. We have looked at the informal private sector, and we said that it accounts for probably about 70% of the labor force. Let's look at the formal private sector. This sector, obviously, these are legitimate companies, businesses that are pretty much registered with the government, with business licenses. Nothing is done under the table. This is what we call the formal sector. Yeah, someone had a question?
Yeah, you said on the notes, it says the informal private sector counts for 60% of the labor force. You just said 70. Which one
70.
should we go?
Yeah, 70%, I would say that's a fair number.
Okay, but on the notes, it said 60. So you want us to go with 70?
Yeah, I think, this is a much more accurate, basically. With the
But it also
70%
says that
and
there's the
60%.
private formal that makes up 10% and the public makes up 30.
Mhm.
So curious how the 10% gets made up elsewhere.
Yeah, well, there's 10% is with the formal private, and 20% is with the government sector.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, basically that's how it's. This is from what I know. Now, in certain countries, it may be different from one region to another. In other words, the resource-rich, labor-abundant, resource-rich, labor-poor, resource-poor, labor-abundant. There may be some differences there. Take a few percentages, take and give, few percentages here and there. But basically, from my own experience, and I have done a lot of work for the government of Libya, basically. So, much of the experience and the information that I have is probably for Libya, simply because I have done a lot of consulting work for the government of Libya, and I'm pretty much familiar with the formal private sector, informal private sector, the government sector in Libya, and really what transpires. And that's where I'm really getting all the information in terms of corruption and in terms of the wages that are paid in Libya. In other words, some people happen to be getting 3 or 4 times as much simply because, they have 3 or 4 different names, basically. And it's a huge corruption scandal, if you will, that has pretty much put the brakes on economic growth in certain countries in the MENA region. But this is basically the formal private sector. Accounts again for between 10 to 15% of the labor force. It has um, disproportionate access. This is the formal private sector. It has disproportionate access to credit, basically, meaning that it starves off the informal private sector from all the credit that's available. And the formal sector, again, obviously, as I said before, happens, to be legit, basically. It's not an underground economy. So it's pretty much registered with the government. It has business licenses, it pays taxes, etc. Unlike the informal sector, of course. But then again, the informal sector happens to be a much more vibrant, if you will, in terms of providing jobs, for people than the formal private sector is. But that's, simply some of the things that we need to pay attention to when we talk about the MENA region um, as
I
a
have a
whole.
question.
Yes.
I'm curious, which one generates more revenues, the private formal or the private informal? Because I know the quality of the informal jobs may be less than the quality of the formal jobs. So which one generates much more, I guess, economic activity?
Okay, the one that generates the most is the informal private sector. That's why when you look at the underground economy for many countries, let's look at the US, for example. The underground economy in the US comprises probably about 10% of total GDP. Look at the underground economy in the MENA region. It comprises about 45% of GDP. So obviously there you can see that the underground economy, which is pretty much populated by the informal private sector, happens to be uh, responsible for about 40% of GDP, which is huge. And unfortunately, the government really doesn't get any benefits from all of that. Why? Because everything is done underground. So no taxes are being paid, whether payroll taxes by both the employer and the employees, is nothing paid right there. Income taxes, nobody's paying their income tax. Um, so, the country loses as a result of that. And um,
But doesn't the quality of the economy kind of improve with the more activity? Wait, even if they get to keep more of it with no taxes?
yes and no. Yes, on the one hand, when we're talking about, more people are actually working and getting a wage, a money wage, but then look at the type of work that they're doing. As far as productivity is concerned, they are at the very low productive scale. That's number one. Number two, they're really not getting paid as much as they ought to be paid. In other words, labor is not very well treated in those sectors uh, in terms of, rules and regulations that pertain to labor are pretty much non-existent in the informal sector. Uh, so yes, in one hand, like I said, yes and no. In one hand, you have jobs, which is better than nothing. And on the other hand, those jobs that you're doing, you're pretty much being exploited. You're not being paid the right wage, basically. The quality of the jobs is very, very poor in terms of productivity. Um, and
And there are high barriers to entry in the private formal market.
yes, in the private formal market, there are much higher barriers to entry. Now, with the informal, there's pretty much no barriers to entry whatsoever, which makes it a lot easier for people to go in and out of the informal sector. But for the private formal sector, of course, there are certain barriers. Why? Simply because the private formal sector happens to be providing jobs that are more productive. Uh, and as a result, they need more skills, more education. So there are more barriers in the formal private. But the informal private is pretty much anyone can go in and anyone can leave. No barriers to entry whatsoever. Okay,
Professor,
yes.
when we talk about employment rate, are we also talking about, or is informal sector included in the unemployment rate,
Yes.
or is that kind of like the blurred area?
No, when we talk about the unemployment rate, we're talking about the overall. So we're including all sectors. We're including the government. We're including the private formal, and we're including the private informal.
Mm, okay.
Everything is included into the unemployment rate base. And this, you know, brings a lot of challenges, difficulties, as I said before, in really trying to estimate what the unemployment rate is. Because after all, how are we going to be measuring the unemployment rate in the informal sector?
Mhm.
Very difficult to do. So, you know, a lot of work needs to be done in those areas. And the government really has to step up in terms of formulating policies pertaining to the labor market. The government really hasn't done much. And as you know, when I was working for the government in Libya as an economic consultant, one of the things that I wanted to look at was simply the structure of the labor market in that particular country. And I wanted to be able to distinguish between, like, you know, what we're saying right now, because this is exactly what I was doing, you know, when I was working as a consultant. I wanted to look at the formal sector, the informal sector, and the government sector. And I wanted to be able to determine exactly how much are being employed in each sector. Now, I couldn't find any information. So what I ended up doing is I ended up estimating and extrapolating. And this is really not something that's very accurate, basically. Um, but, you know, sometimes you got to work with what you have. And unfortunately, one of the things that I came up with in my report was that the government has to take a more active role in trying to structure the labor market, in trying to formulate new rules, regulations pertaining to the labor market, so as to be able to get more information, more data, secure better, accurate data on what is transpiring in the labor market. Because with the current conditions, with what you have right now in the labor market, it's really very, very blurred, very, very, you know, there's a lot of gray areas. And as a result, you know, you won't be able to advise governments on formulating the proper macroeconomic policies, because the labor market really presents an extremely important key to the working of the total economy. Because when we look at the macroeconomy, there are basically four markets that we want to focus on. The labor market is the major market. That's number one. Number two, the goods market, the money market, and the bond market. And now in Libya, of course, the bond market is non-existent, you know, except, you know, with the central bank and some banks, private banks in Libya that happen to deal in bonds, but that's about it. So it's extremely weak market. So here, of course, you have to really focus on the money market, the goods market, and the labor market. And you have to make sure that all these markets are well structured, and you have to make sure that you can get pertinent data on all these markets, because if you can't, then obviously, you know, there's very little that you can do to advise policymakers on macroeconomic policy, because macroeconomic policy, as I said, is really based on what is transpiring in all of these markets. And unfortunately, in the MENA region, um, many countries in the MENA region, you find that these markets are pretty much left, if you will, to their own workings or to their own happenings, if you will, and there isn't really much that the government is engaged in so as to make sure that these markets have the proper structures, the proper functions, and as a result, we're able to gather pertinent data on all markets. And if we don't start from there, in other words, that's really the starting point, that we need to make sure that all these markets are pretty much modernized, all these markets are pretty much well structured, and we simply have to follow the basic criterias that are used in most countries. And all what we need to do is simply go to the World Bank or the IMF, and the criterias are pretty well defined, very clearly defined. So we really don't have to reinvent the wheel, basically. I mean, everything is there available for us. All what we have to do is make sure that these criterias are being followed. And make sure that all the players in the region are pretty much acquainted with all these criteria. Now, if we do that, that will certainly help the MENA region um, in their quest for more rapid economic growth. So, as I said, economic growth and economic development is a very complex phenomenon. And there are so many factors that go into it. And we can't just be relying on certain factors. In other words, we have to make sure that it's pretty much comprehensive. We have to make sure that the country is working on all cylinders. Because if one cylinder is not working, then obviously that's going to cause a huge disruption to the locomotive, so to speak, to be moving from point A to point B. So, we have to have all cylinders working, basically. And as I said, it's a lot easier said than done. In practice, it takes a lot of resources, takes a lot of patience, a lot of time, perseverance, and education and knowledge, of course. Extremely important. So you really have to be pretty much suited with all these things in order to be able to arrive at your goal or your objective. Okay, so that's something that hopefully can shed some light on what's going on in the MENA region by simply telling you this. And this is all from experience, by the way. This has nothing to do with theory. This has nothing to do with what sometimes you see written in books by authors that don't have first-hand experience. Now, I'm talking from experience. I have actually gone through these things. I know what it entails to put one and one together. That's why, always I'm saying here, it's a lot easier said than done. When it comes to practice, when it comes to application, there are so many problems involved that it is extremely difficult to put one and one together. Even though, to a lot of you, it may look easy or seem easy, but in practice, in reality, it's huge headache. It really puts a huge headache on those who are trying to, formulate policies or put recommendations. And sometimes, when I write reports, it's not an easy thing to do. Sometimes, I happen to change that report 4 or 5 times before I actually end up submitting it to the Ministry of Planning. I was actually working for the Ministry of Planning, and it's not an easy thing to do. It's very arduous task, to say the least. But it's something that you have to do anyway. Okay, so basically, this is some of the things that I just wanted to make sure that we have a handle on. Um, Now, in summary, what do you think? In other words, if I were to ask you this question in summary, how does um, demographic change basically affect economic development? In what ways do you think that demographic changes that occurred in the MENA region have actually changed the economic landscape of that region? In what ways? What can you say? What type of answer can you give me if I were to ask you that?
Definitely want to talk about the youth bulge and how there's a weak private market that can't really sustain all the jobs necessary for all of the new people entering the labor force.
Very good.
And from that, you also have a lack of high paying jobs that go with all the education that is supposedly strived for and supposedly valued, but can't be put to work anywhere. So, with the demographic of people going to college and now a lot of young people coming in that just came out of college and know where to go, that really does change the economic landscape.
Very good. Excellent. Yeah. So those are basically some good points. And I
Uh,
get, yeah, go ahead.
you when you also talk about the immigration to higher, wealthier nations in the MENA region, and because there's no youth willing to take the lower paying jobs, an increase in immigration would lead.
Very
I
good.
mean, demand for low paid wage would lead to an increase in immigration.
Absolutely. This is extremely important, as you will see that in the MENA region, there is a lot of migration taking place from resource poor, labor abundant to resource rich, labor poor countries. In other words, if you look at the resource rich labor poor, such as Saudi Arabia, uh, the GCC basically, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, that's basically the GCC. Those are the resource rich labor poor. And if you add to them Libya, Libya is also a resource rich labor poor country. You will find that a lot of people migrate to these countries for the simple reason because of the job opportunities available and also the higher wages paid in these countries. So this obviously puts a huge pressure on these countries in terms of what do you think are the type of pressure that this um, migration would represent in these countries?
I'm curious if there would be like a brain drain effect on the type of jobs that are available in the resource rich, labor poor countries. Because if they're just the low paying jobs that the natives don't want to take because they have cushy public sector jobs, then that's a different story than if they have the high level jobs available and can't
Actually,
really fill
yeah.
them.
Well, and as far as migration is concerned, it's taking place in both ways. In other words, you have the unskilled as well as the skilled. So, yes, there is a brain drain also involved because you see a lot of the engineers, a lot of the doctors, physicians, uh, um, university professors, etc., happen to leave these countries, the poor countries, going to the rich countries and finding jobs there. Also, you find a lot of unskilled, uneducated workers as well. So both of them are actually involved in the migration process, not only the skilled, but also the unskilled.
Professor, could you repeat your question? Because I think it has something to do with social safety nets that the MENA region doesn't provide to non-citizens, right?
You're asking me the question?
No. Could you repeat your question, please?
Oh, the person who posed the question, can you repeat that?
No, I posed the question. Could you repeat your question? Because I think I had another
What
idea to,
question are you asking me to repeat?
the one previously. What is this?
The demographic
Oh,
effect on
okay.
economic
Yeah,
development.
yeah. What I was saying is, how do you think this demographic change in the MENA region has impacted economic development? Or how has it changed the economic landscape?
Wouldn't cheaper goods be a form of this migration?
Cheaper goods?
Because you're paying a lot less for labor.
Yeah, yeah. That could be. That could be. But you have obviously presented some good points, both of you, in as far as the impact of this demographic change on the economic landscape. Which is they're pretty good points, but the things that you have to remember here, in as far as um, the impact of this migration, if you will, um, in these countries, since you brought the migration factor here and you said that one of the demographic changes that would occur, especially in the resource rich, labor poor countries who are now actually taking in a lot of migrant workers from other regions. This obviously would, this demographic change would impact these countries tremendously. Um, in one way, of course, what it would do is that it would force these countries to invest more in human development, in education, in health, because now you have a lot of people there working for you. So you got to be able to take care of these people now. So in other words, now you have a lot of mouths to feed, basically. Than before, you have a lot of kids to educate. You have a lot of people to take care of health-wise. Um, so, these countries obviously are pretty much forced to invest heavily in the social infrastructure. And the other thing, of course, that this may also affect the political um, arena as well, simply because now you have a lot of people who are actually involved in developing the economy, in building the economy. Um, these people now will have a voice. Um, and sometimes, these countries, especially the GCC, are not willing to give these people a voice in the political process. But now, what are you going to do? How are you going to prevent these people from having a voice? Because these people now have proved themselves to be extremely important in as far as economic growth is concerned. They're pretty much participating in the economic effort. So, they're a force to be reckoned with. And now, as a result, these governments will not be able to um, avoid that issue. Now they really have to address it. And they have to address it in such a way as to make sure that obviously it will not harm them politically. Because if these people go on demonstrations, for example, or if they try to actually get their rights by force, so to speak, um, then things are going to change. You will have political instability, and so yes, this demographic change is obviously going to make changes economically, politically, socially. It will have an impact, and these countries must be well prepared with economic, political, and social plans to make sure that these people are integrated into the country in a way that will not cause disruptions, in a way that will not lead to political upheavals, and so on. And unfortunately, a lot of these countries are not ready for that, by the way, and they have not made the necessary plans. So this is like a ticking bomb. It has not reached a point right now in the GCC countries where it's going to explode. But you can rest assured that a point will be reached where this ticking bomb will start to obviously come into life, if you will. And when that happens, then it would be too late to start designing, formulating plans to actually address these issues. So, as far as these governments are concerned in the GCC, now is the time to formulate the right plans to make sure that these migrant workers are being integrated in a proper way, to make sure that they will be given their rights, because right now they have no rights whatsoever. And this could cause a lot of problems down the road. Again, it's
Is it more
taking
for rights or for political representation?
No, they don't have economic rights. They don't have political rights. They don't have social. They have nothing basically. They're simply used as machines. That's all it is.
Youch.
Yep, absolutely. In the MENA region. And this is a huge problem that the MENA region has really not addressed. I think they're going to be very sorry that they weren't actually looking at these problems seriously to try and address them in a way that is pertinent. And as I said, and this day is coming sooner than later. This would be one of the advices that I would give to these countries. One of the first advices: make sure go back to the drawing boards and make sure that you have the right plans resonated to make sure that something like this will not happen. And if it happens, you're ready for it, basically. But anyway, so those are basically some of the things that it's important to get a handle on and make sure that they are being addressed in their proper fashion, if you will. Yeah, this is basically all that I want to say about unemployment in the region, demographic changes. And as I said, when we talk about demographic changes, the thing that we have in mind is simply population growth, the composition of population, the youth bulge, the demographic dividend. In fact, one of the things that, by the way, will replace the demographic dividend in as far as economic growth is concerned in the MENA region. Can someone tell me what demographic dividend is?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What is demographic dividend? I guess we explained this many times before.
Is it when the labor force grows faster than the population?
Very good. When the labor force grows faster than population, that's when you have what we call a demographic dividend. And this is extremely important in as far as economic growth is concerned. Now, you know, the demographic dividend in other less developed countries, especially the Southeast Asian countries, was responsible for 33% of economic growth. That's how important the demographic dividend is. Was responsible for 33% of economic growth. However, for the MENA region, demographic dividend did not play any role. And the reason is simply because demographic dividend happened to peak at the time of the last decade. In other words, 1985, 86. That's when demographic dividend peaked. At that time, you know, the MENA region was really going through some austere economic circumstances. In other words, their economy was really not doing so well simply because of the structural shift. And as a result, they really had no use for this economic dividend. So the economic dividend, all it did do in the MENA region was cause this youth bulge, basically. You know, if it is exploited correctly, this could be a huge asset for the MENA region to have a demographic dividend in as far as economic growth is concerned. Now, what could replace the demographic dividend in the MENA region is another phenomenon, which is the labor force participation rate by women. Because you see now, the labor force participation rate by women has increased tremendously from 25% to about 42%. So that will actually replace the demographic dividend for the MENA region. Now you have more women actually participating in the labor force, which is pretty good for economic growth. So those are, you know, some of the demographic indicators, if you will, in as far as economic growth, economic development is concerned in the MENA region. And it's very, very important to pay close attention to these issues because demographics is not only important in the MENA region, but it's important everywhere you go. Demographics is responsible for shaping part of the economic landscape. Not all, but part of the economic landscape, political landscape, social landscape. So you see, demographics happen to play a huge role in all of these changes. That's the importance of demographics. Okay, so we only have 2 minutes left, and I will open it for any questions that you may have.
At some point, might have been like a week or two ago, you went into depth about a specific country. I think it was either Egypt or Iran, and mentioned that it would be focused on the test. I was curious about which country that ended up being.
I would say Egypt.
Egypt? Okay.
Yeah, Egypt.
And what aspects
if
in
there are any
particular?
specific questions in the exam regarding countries, you'll probably, you know, refer to Egypt or Libya, basically, because these are the two countries that we talked most about. In fact, we really haven't touched on other countries, even though, you know, I would like to touch on every country, but unfortunately, we really don't have the time to talk about each country separately. That's why we have put them into groups, basically. um, because this is probably will take so much time to be able to talk about each country separately. Any other questions?
Professor, so as of now, we're done with chapters 1 through 4. So on Thursday, are we going to go over the exam discussion?
Yes, that's what we're going to be doing Thursday. Exam, midterm exam.
Okay, and then on Tuesday, are we going to take it or are we going to take it next Thursday?
No, we'll take it on Tuesday.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's going to be pretty much an open book anyway, because you're going to do it online. So, I'm not going to check and see if you're using books or notes or whatever. So it's not going to be that difficult. You will have all the information. Your only job there is simply to try and put that information together and come up with a coherent analysis of a particular issue. Basically, that's what the exam is going to be about. In other words, when I grade your answers, I want to make sure that first of all you're using your own words, and then I want to see how you tackle those issues. From which angle are you tackling them? And also I want to see if the answers that you give are coherent, are based on sound economic, social, and political trajectories. So those are the type of things I'm looking for, basically. And I'm sure, by now all of you have a pretty much a good idea of the MENA region's weaknesses, challenges. Any other question?
Somebody had a question in the chat if the exam is going to be on titanium or is it going to be like a Word document we submit?
No, it's going to be on Word document that you're going to submit. It will be on titanium. Yeah, I can see all the chats right here in front of me. Yeah, it will be on titanium, and it's like when you I don't know if some of you have already presented their writing assignment or not, but if you did, it's going to be very, very similar to that. Just on Word document and just submit it through titanium. So you just go to midterm exam, click on that, and pretty much submit your answers in Word document. So the exam is on the 13th. Yes, if that corresponds to Tuesday, next Tuesday. You're absolutely right. I don't have a calendar in front of me right now, but if that corresponds to next Tuesday, then you're right. Next Tuesday is correct. Okay, the exam will be okay. Thank you. Do we have the time limit? Yes, the time limit is 1 hour and 15 minutes. You have 3 questions to answer in 1 hour, 15 minutes.
Approximately how long a response should we get? Past a certain point, do you just
Yeah.
not want to read like 10 pages if you
No,
can
no,
write
no,
10
no, no, no. That's
pages?
a very good question. No, absolutely not. We don't have the time to be reading 10 pages or even 2 pages. No, let's say that, half a page for each question would be enough. Half a
Perfect.
page.
Thank you.
Yeah, half a page. In other words, just focus on the question itself. Don't bring in any irrelevant details that we don't need to answer that particular question. So zero in on the question and just answer it directly. So, half a page, if you really have all the points that we need, that's fine. I mean, sometimes, you don't need to have all the points, but at least the most important points that you feel are important, and you just use those to actually answer the question. Let's see if there are any other questions. No, I guess not. I guess that was the end of the chat. No more questions. Okay, so that's it.
Oh, you said 3 questions on the exam. Are you changing it from 5 to 3, or are we going to have to answer 3 out of the 5?
3 out of 5.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes, I will go over the questions next time. That's what we will be doing in the review session. Well, I'll probably be going over some questions that I feel you will see in the exam. So we will pretty much talk about those. And also, if anyone has any questions, then you can throw those questions at me in the review session. Will I go over the exact questions? No. Then if I go over the exact questions, then obviously there is no need to come and take the exam. But I will go over similar questions. Okay, guys, thank you very much for attending today's lecture, and hopefully I will see you on Thursday for the review session, and then on Tuesday for the midterm exam. So we have already decided on the date for the midterm exam. Okay,
Thank you, Professor.
thank you very much. So I have to run because I have one lecture right now, so I need to run. Okay, guys, take care.
Goodbye, Professor.
Bye-bye.